Man, is toxic leadership really that prevalent, or is it an overused phrase? Coming up. Stoker here, and today we're going to talk about toxic leadership. I think this is a phrase that we've seen become really popular. It's kind of invented back in the late 90s, but it's become extremely popular, especially in the military. Army Times has used this phrase countless of times. Can't even count how many times. That's why it's countless. And I think it's something worth talking about and worth sharing some thoughts on. Because it is something that we just use so much, and sometimes, my wife and I, we just shared our 23rd anniversary, and kind of a tradition. We were watching The Princess Bride, and of course, it said we're inconceivable, and Andre the Giant said, Inigo Montoya says, I don't think this word means what you think it means, and so I think the same thing is kind of true when it comes to the phrase toxic leadership. I think we use this phrase all the time, but does it really mean what we think it means and what it's conveying? Because communication has three things, three parts, three elements, right? What I said, what you heard, and what I meant for you to hear. And so let's break this down. So Wikipedia says a toxic leader is somebody who has responsibility over, not that Wikipedia is the go-to, but it's a common understandings. Someone who has a responsibility over a group of people and who abuses the leader-follower relationship by leaving the group or organization in a worse condition than when they were first found. And of course it goes on to talk about some different traits being, operationally rigid, intemperate, aggressive, oppositional behavior, power politics, perfectionist attitudes, aggressive narcissism, and the list goes on of traits. But where I think, I think where this really comes in being used, and this is why we have to be careful, because if we're not careful, then anybody who has a direct style of leadership is going to be labeled as a toxic leader. If you don't like what your leader tells you, toxic leader. Get your feelings hurt, toxic leader. Have to come into work, have to actually do some work, toxic leader. And you can see how dangerous of a game this goes, because we use the phrase, and the phrase means things to certain people. And so when they hear it, they assume what's happening and what's going on down on the lines, and they start to make decisions. And I think that everybody out there knows this, right? And so they start using this phrase more and more often, even though it doesn't mean what they think that it means. Now, in Stoker's opinion, and I don't 100% disagree or agree with Wikipedia, I think, but in Stoker's opinion, it's ultimately, I think, the root that we have to try to find in what we're talking about here is fear. I believe that a toxic leader is one who leads out of and through or in some type of fear. And I think this can be prevalent when somebody is afraid to say something. Somebody is afraid to challenge a question or an answer because they believe that their future is in jeopardy if they do so. Somebody who's physically afraid, right? Somebody who physically fears for their well-being. Right? And so you have this psychological or even this physical fear that's embedded and interwoven on a day-to-day basis. And it has to be more, I think, than what somebody might call the good old boy network being existent. That if you're not part of the club, then you're on the outside. I think it needs to be larger than that. And not that I agree with cliques or anything of this nature, but it's got because I think it just a toxic leader, and I guess it could could a toxic leader make a hostile work environment, for example? And that's another phrase that's kind of overused. For one person, could one person, and is that enough? Is one person enough to experience that? And the answer is yes. So we also need to be careful about biases towards the other way. But I think we just really have to come back in and look at the specifics of what's being said, what's happening, how things are working through. And I think this is, Wikipedia had some good things to think about. Is the organization worse off when somebody leaves than when they came? Are people also worse off when they came than when they first arrived? So I think it's really two really good things that kind of brings it back into the definition of leadership. And of course, the definition of Army leadership is to provide purpose, direction, motivation to accomplish the mission and improve the organization. And we know that as leaders, we have two basic responsibilities, right? Two basic primal things that we have to do and that we have to get right. One, let's accomplish the mission, and two, let's take care of our people. So if we're not doing these two things, one or the other of these two things, then we're not being an effective or a good leader. So if we leave an organization and dudes are more broken internally, right, or even externally, because maybe it was physical abuse, then maybe somebody was doing something a little wrong or something that was straight up toxic. Or if an organization as a whole is broken, the systems are broken, then we can look at that as well. So I don't know, man, there's a few thoughts, a few things to think about. I think, again, I think it's something that we have to, this is a phrase we almost have to stop using and only use when it's right. It's like saying, man, I love that movie. I love that car. I love that pen. I love that phone. Right, then what the hell does love mean anymore? So we got to be careful about these things. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below, and we will keep this conversation rolling. Maybe you've had a toxic leader. Maybe you've had somebody who is coined as a toxic leader. Maybe you just want to share some thoughts or some insights down below, and we can keep this conversation rolling. And as always, until then, man, y'all, you keep grinding.